Sir, I need you to stop resisting and come with me right now. The words cut through the fluorescent-lit grocery store like a blade, but Otis Hayes didn't flinch. At 73, he'd heard those words before. Too many times, in too many places, spoken by too many officers who saw his dark skin before they saw anything else. His arthritic hands remained steady on his shopping cart handle as Officer Derek Redmond grabbed his wrist. I haven't done anything wrong, son. Otis's voice carried the weight of decades, calm, measured, tired. I paid for my groceries. The receipt's right there in the bag. Redmond's grip tightened. Around them, other shoppers had frozen mid-aisle, phones already emerging from pockets. A mother pulled her children closer. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Redmond said, his voice rising. He was 28, built like the high school linebacker he'd once been, and carrying the kind of anger that made everything look like a threat. The store manager hovered nearby, whispering, I saw him put items in his coat. But Otis Hayes wasn't homeless. He wore a simple cardigan over a pressed white shirt, his gray slacks creased with the kind of care that spoke of a man who still believed in dignity. His wedding ring, worn thin after 51 years, caught the overhead lights as Redmond twisted his arm behind his back. The groceries scattered. Canned soup rolled across the linoleum. A loaf of bread tumbled from the bag, followed by a small container of medicine, the kind that cost more than some people's rent. As Redmond forced Otis toward the exit, an elderly woman's voice rose above the murmur of shocked whispers. Stop it. Can't you see he's hurt? Otis's left knee buckled. The same knee that had taken shrapnel in Vietnam, the one that had never quite healed right. But Redmond didn't slow down. If anything, he pulled harder, his jaw set with the determination of a man proving a point. Please, Otis said quietly. My knee. Should have thought about that before you decided to steal. The automatic doors whooshed open, and the afternoon heat hit them like a wall. Redmond's patrol car sat parked at an angle across two spaces, its blue and white paint gleaming in the sun. He slammed Otis against the hood with enough force to leave a dent. Hands on the car. Spread your legs. Otis complied, his breathing steady despite the pain shooting through his knee. 30 feet away, a teenager with a phone was recording everything. Other phones appeared like digital witnesses, capturing every moment. I need to see some identification, Redmond said, his hand resting on Otis's back to keep him pinned. Let's find out who we're dealing with here. Otis reached slowly into his back pocket. The same movement he'd made countless times before, always careful, always deliberate, always aware that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted as a threat. His wallet was worn leather, soft with age, containing the usual items: credit cards, insurance cards, a faded photo of his late wife, Eleanor, and his government-issued ID. Redmond flipped the wallet open. Driver's license. Nothing. Then his thumb slid the second card into view. The color drained from his face. He stared at it again, like the words might change if he looked hard enough. And his grip on Otis's arm loosened. Sir, he whispered, voice cracking. I. Otis turned slowly, his movements deliberate despite the tremor in Redmond's voice. 51 years of marriage had taught him to read people's faces, and what he saw in Redmond's eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was pure terror. Federal Judge Otis Hayes, Otis said quietly, straightening his cardigan. Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And you are? Redmond's hand fell away completely. The federal identification card seemed to burn in his fingers. The same kind of card he'd seen in training videos, the ones that came with warnings about jurisdiction and consequences that could end careers with a single phone call. Officer Redmond, sir. Derek Redmond. The words tumbled out. Aye, there's been a misunderstanding. Behind them, someone was live, and people were already sharing it. Redmond's radio crackled with dispatcher chatter that seemed impossibly loud. Redmond, what's your status out there? The voice belonged to Sergeant Vivian Coleman, a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough rookie mistakes to write a textbook. Store managers calling asking about an arrest. Redmond fumbled for his radio, his thumb hovering over the button. How could he explain this? How could he tell dispatch that he'd just assaulted a federal judge based on nothing more than racial profiling and a store manager's paranoia? Otis watched him struggle, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something deeper. Something that looked like disappointment that had been building for decades. You know, Otis said, his voice still calm. My late wife Eleanor used to shop at this store. Every Saturday for 15 years. Never once did anyone question whether she belonged here. Redmond's throat felt like sandpaper. Sir, she was white, Otis continued, adjusting his torn sleeve where Redmond's grip had been. Funny how that worked. The words hit Redmond like physical blows. He'd grown up in this town, graduated from the local high school where Otis's portrait hung in the Hall of Distinguished Alumni, though Redmond had never bothered to look closely at those faces. His own father had been a police officer, killed in a car accident when Redmond was 16. The badge had been Derek's inheritance, his purpose, his identity. Now it felt like a weight dragging him underwater. I remember your father, Otis said suddenly, his voice softer now. He had a reputation for showing up when it mattered. He tried to do the right thing. Redmond's blood turned to ice. You what? The revelation staggered Redmond. He'd carried his father's badge number, worn his father's watch, followed his father's footsteps into law enforcement. And now the same man who'd honored his father's memory was standing before him. Someone Redmond had just humiliated. Why would you remember that? Redmond's voice cracked. Because I make it my business to remember the good ones, Otis said. What would your father think of what you just did? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Around them, the parking lot had filled with onlookers. The store manager emerged, receipt in hand, his face pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Redmond's radio crackled again. Redmond, respond. We've got calls coming in about excessive force. Need your location. This time, Redmond keyed the mic. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. 10-4, Sergeant. I need supervision at my location. Immediately. Copy that. Sending backup. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived, followed by Sergeant Coleman's unmarked sedan. She stepped out, a compact woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and took in the scene with the efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up messes before. What's the situation, Redmond? Redmond opened his mouth, but Otis spoke first. Officer Redmond made an honest mistake, Sergeant. These things happen. Coleman's eyes narrowed. She'd known Redmond since he was a rookie, had seen the anger that simmered beneath his professional exterior. She'd also worked enough cases to recognize when someone was trying to defuse a bomb. Is that so? She looked at Otis more carefully, noting the torn sleeve, the scattered groceries, the phones pointed in their direction. And you are? Otis handed her his identification. Coleman glanced at it, did a double take, and read it again. Her eyes flicked to Redmond. One look that said, "This just became your whole life." Judge Hayes, she said carefully. I apologize for any inconvenience. No inconvenience at all, Otis replied. Though I do think Officer Redmond might benefit from some additional training on de-escalation techniques. It was a lifeline and everyone knew it. Otis Hayes could have destroyed Redmond's career with a single word. Instead, he was offering mercy, the kind of grace that made Coleman realize why this man wore judicial robes. But mercy had limits. The store manager approached, still clutching Otis's receipt. His face was ashen as he looked between the officers and Otis. Judge Hayes, I need to apologize. There was no theft. The receipt shows everything was paid for. I was wrong. Otis turned to face him, and for the first time, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You were wrong about what? The manager swallowed. I thought. Say it, Otis said, calm as glass. The manager couldn't. Then the teenager with the phone spoke up, her voice carrying across the parking lot with the clarity of youth unafraid of consequences. He assumed because you're black, you were stealing. Same reason the cop grabbed you. Same reason this keeps happening. The words hung in the air like an indictment that couldn't be appealed. Coleman looked at Redmond, whose face had gone white again. She looked at Otis, who stood with the dignity of someone who'd faced this particular demon too many times to count. And then her radio exploded with chatter that made everyone freeze. All units, all units. Shift commander is en route. Internal Affairs has been notified. Preserve all body cam and store footage. Coleman's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. He was a federal judge known for civil rights cases. And now every news outlet in the country was about to learn that he'd been assaulted by a police officer over groceries. Coleman keyed her radio with hands that barely trembled. Dispatch, this is Coleman. I need the shift commander at my location immediately. And get someone from public affairs. But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. Redmond stared at his radio as the chatter continued, each transmission another nail in the coffin of his career. His father's watch felt heavy on his wrist. The same watch that had stopped at 3:47 p.m. on the day Nathan Redmond died, trying to be a hero. Coleman's radio crackled again, quieter now, urgent. Supervisor, public affairs, and internal affairs are all responding. Do not move the subject. Preserve all video. Redmond swallowed, because the next person to arrive wouldn't be backup. It would be accountability. A supervisor arrived first, then a second unit. Within minutes, the shift commander's unmarked car pulled in. Captain Michael Varela emerged, his uniform crisp despite the summer heat. At 55, he'd climbed the ranks by knowing when to fight battles and when to manage them. This was definitely management territory. Sergeant Coleman, he called, striding across the parking lot with purpose. Status report. Coleman glanced at Otis, who stood quietly beside Redmond's patrol car, still wearing the dignity that made everyone around him feel smaller. Sir, we have a complex situation. Varela followed her gaze to Otis, taking in the torn sleeve, the scattered groceries that hadn't been collected, the phone still recording from multiple angles. His expression never changed, but Coleman saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the look of a man calculating political damage. Judge Hayes, Varela said, extending his hand. Captain Varela, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today. Otis shook the offered hand but didn't smile. Captain, this goes beyond inconvenience. Of course. We take allegations of misconduct very seriously. Varela's voice carried the smooth cadence of someone who'd given this speech before. I'd like to invite you to come to the station so we can discuss this properly. Get your statement in a more private setting. It was a polite way of saying, let's get you away from the cameras. Otis's pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. I think I'll stay here for now, Captain. In the open air. With witnesses. The rejection landed like a slap. Varela's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Behind him, another unmarked car arrived. Internal affairs, most likely, though no one was announcing titles yet. Redmond watched the parade of officials arrive with growing dread. Each new face represented another level of authority, another person whose career could be damaged by his mistake. His radio crackled with constant chatter now. Other units being pulled off their beats, supervisors converging, the machinery of damage control grinding into motion. Officer Redmond, Varela said, his voice sharp. I need your body cam footage transferred to Detective Porter immediately. Redmond's hand moved instinctively to the camera on his chest, but his face went pale. Sir, the camera was experiencing technical difficulties today. The lie hung in the air like toxic gas. Coleman's eyes narrowed. Your camera was working in the store. Redmond didn't answer. Varela's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind his pupils. Otis raised an eyebrow, his judicial instincts recognizing perjury when he heard it. Technical difficulties, Varela repeated. Yes, sir. I filed a maintenance request this morning. It was Redmond's second lie in 30 seconds, and everyone knew it. Mr. Redmond, Otis said quietly, are you familiar with federal law regarding destruction of evidence? The question cut through Redmond like a blade. Destruction of evidence wasn't just a career-ending offense. It was a felony that could result in prison time. And Otis's use of Mr. Redmond, instead of Officer Redmond, sent a clear message about where this was heading. Varela stepped forward. Judge Hayes, I'm sure we can resolve this amicably. Officer Redmond made an error in judgment, but there's no need for this to become a federal matter. Captain, Otis said, his voice still calm but with an edge that cut glass. When a police officer assaults a citizen based solely on racial profiling, then lies about his body camera to cover it up, it's already a federal matter. The words struck the assembled officials like lightning. Redmond felt his world tilting off its axis. Furthermore, Otis continued, this appears to be part of a pattern. Coleman looked at Varela, then at Redmond, pieces clicking together. Captain, this isn't his first complaint. It's his seventh. Everyone turned to look at her. Varela's expression went from political concern to genuine alarm. 7 complaints, Coleman repeated louder now. All from minorities. All ruled unfounded due to insufficient evidence. She looked at Redmond with something between pity and disgust. All involving body cam malfunctions. Redmond felt the ground beneath him cracking. Those complaints had been handled quietly, filed away, forgotten. At least, he'd thought they were forgotten. He'd never imagined that someone had been keeping count. Otis nodded slowly. And you signed off on every one. Coleman's gaze shifted to Varela, whose face had gone ashen. The captain had personally approved every single dismissal, rubber stamping Redmond's explanations and sweeping problems under rugs that were getting dangerously lumpy. "The pattern isn't just Officer Redmond," Otis said, his judicial voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. "It's systemic. It's institutional. And it ends today." The declaration hung in the air like a judgment handed down from a higher court, which, in a very real sense, it was. Otis Hayes wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a federal judge who had just witnessed evidence of civil rights violations and an attempted cover-up. Varela reached for his radio, his political instincts finally kicking in. "Dispatch, I need the chief of police at this location immediately." But Otis held up a hand. "Captain, I wouldn't make any more calls just yet." "Why not?" "Because," Otis said, pulling out his cell phone, "I already made mine." The phone was still warm from the call Otis had placed while Varela was doing his damage control dance. He'd used those crucial minutes wisely. "I called the U.S. Attorney's office," Otis said. "Not to make threats. To preserve evidence. They know my name. They know this store. And they will request everything connected to this incident." He looked at Varela. "The smart move now is simple. Preserve every file, every camera angle, every report. Because if you don't, someone else will." Redmond sank against his patrol car. His father's watch felt impossibly heavy now. Not because it carried the weight of legacy, but because it carried the weight of shame. Everything his father had stood for, everything Redmond had tried to honor, was crumbling around him. But Otis wasn't finished. "My wife volunteered 3 blocks from here," Otis said quietly. "She spent years trying to build trust." He glanced at the scattered groceries. "And you broke it in minutes." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Eleanor Hayes hadn't just been the wife of a federal judge. She'd been a bridge between the community and the system, someone who'd spent decades trying to build trust that officers like Redmond destroyed in minutes. Redmond looked up, tears threatening. "Sir, She died last year," Otis said simply. "And one of her last wishes was that I'd find a way to fix the broken trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve." The weight of it settled over everyone like a blanket of lead. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It wasn't about one officer's mistake or one department's corruption. It was about Eleanor Hayes's dying wish and Otis's promise to honor it. It was about a legacy that Redmond had just helped fulfill in the worst possible way. Varela's radio crackled with increasing urgency as words spread through the department. Units were being reassigned. Supervisors were converging. The mayor's office was asking questions nobody wanted to answer. And in the distance, Redmond could see the first news van pulling into the parking lot, drawn by social media reports and scanner chatter that had made this story impossible to contain. The reckoning Eleanor Hayes had dreamed of was about to begin. And this time, nobody was going to pretend it didn't happen. Within 20 minutes, cameras showed up. Not all at once, but enough to change the air. A crowd formed. Phones stayed raised. The parking lot stopped feeling like a grocery store and started feeling like a stage. Varela watched the media arrive with the expression of a man watching his political future collapse in real time. Each new camera represented another angle, another perspective, another way the situation could spiral beyond his control. "Captain," Coleman said quietly, "we need to make a decision about Redmond." Redmond stood beside his patrol car like a defendant awaiting sentencing. The weight of 7 complaints, 2 lies, and 1 federal judge's scrutiny had left him looking pale and shrunken inside his uniform. His father's watch caught the afternoon light, a reminder of everything he'd failed to live up to. "What kind of decision?" Varela asked, though they both knew the answer. "He needs to be suspended immediately. Badge and gun. Before Internal Affairs even starts their investigation." It was standard procedure for serious misconduct allegations, but Varela hesitated. Suspending Redmond would be an admission that something had gone terribly wrong, and admissions created liability that city attorneys spent their careers avoiding. Otis watched the exchange with the patience of someone who'd seen bureaucratic cowardice before. In his 32 years on the federal bench, he'd witnessed countless attempts to minimize, deflect, and delay justice. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't a case file. It was him. "Excuse me, Judge Hayes?" The voice belonged to Maria Santos from Channel 7. She'd arrived with a cameraman and the kind of preparation that suggested this story had legs. "I'm wondering if you'd be willing to comment on what happened here today?" Otis considered the question carefully. Every word he spoke would be dissected, analyzed, and potentially used in court proceedings that could stretch for years. But silence wasn't neutral. Not when cameras were rolling and justice was at stake. I was shopping for groceries, he said simply. Officer Redmond accused me of theft based on nothing more than assumptions. When I showed him my identification, he realized those assumptions were wrong. Are you planning to file a civil rights complaint? I'm planning to ensure this never happens to anyone else. It was a careful answer that said everything without committing to anything. The kind of response that came from decades of weighing words like evidence in a courtroom scale. Behind the reporter, Redmond watched the interview with growing dread. Each question, each careful answer, represented another nail in the coffin of his career. He'd thought the worst part was over when Varela arrived. He'd been wrong. The worst part was just beginning. His phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, Sarah. Derek, what's happening? Someone posted a video on Facebook saying you arrested a federal judge? Please tell me this isn't real. Redmond stared at the message, his throat tight. Sarah was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they'd already named Emma, after Redmond's mother. She'd been planning the nursery, reading parenting books, talking about the kind of father Redmond would be. How could he explain that their daughter would grow up knowing her father as the police officer who'd assaulted an elderly black man over groceries? Officer Redmond, a voice called. Redmond looked up to see Detective Lisa Porter approaching, a 20-year veteran from internal affairs whose reputation for thoroughness had ended more careers than budget cuts. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen every kind of lie, excuse, and cover-up that desperate officers could invent. Detective Porter, Varela said, stepping forward. I didn't know you'd been assigned to this case. I wasn't assigned, Porter replied. I volunteered. The distinction was important. Assign meant routine. Volunteer meant personal interest. And personal interest from internal affairs was the kind of attention that kept police officers awake at night. Porter turned to Redmond with the expression of a prosecutor examining evidence. Officer Redmond, I need you to surrender your service weapon and badge immediately. Redmond's hands trembled as he unholstered his gun. The weight of it, 3 pounds of steel and authority, had felt natural for 6 years. Now it felt like carrying evidence of his own guilt. Your badge, Porter continued. He unpinned his badge with shaking hands. As Porter sealed it in an evidence bag, Redmond felt something fundamental shift inside him. Without the badge, he wasn't a police officer anymore. He was just Derek Redmond, a man who'd made terrible choices and would have to live with the consequences. This is just temporary, Varela said, though his voice lacked conviction. Until we can sort this all out. Porter's expression suggested she knew exactly how this would sort out. In her experience, officers who lied about body cameras during civil rights incidents didn't get second chances, especially when federal judges were involved. I'll need your body camera as well, she said. Redmond's face went ashen. I told Captain Varela it was malfunctioning. I heard what you told Captain Varela, Porter interrupted, and what Sergeant Coleman said about it working in the store. So let's see what kind of malfunction we're dealing with. She examined the camera with the efficiency of someone who'd handled dozens of malfunctioning devices. After 30 seconds, she looked up with an expression that could have frozen lava. The camera's working perfectly, she said. It's been recording this entire conversation. She paused, letting that sink in, including the moment you lied about it. Redmond felt the world tilt on its axis. The camera had been recording everything. His lies to Varela, his admission about the 7 complaints, his entire breakdown. Every word was now evidence in a federal civil rights investigation. Otis watched the revelation unfold with something that might have been sympathy. He'd seen careers destroyed by smaller lies than this. But sympathy didn't erase the damage Redmond had done, to himself, to his department, and to every citizen who needed to trust that police officers would treat them fairly. Detective Porter, Otis said, I'd like to request that all video evidence be preserved. Already planned, Your Honor. This footage will be preserved immediately. Varela stepped forward. Now wait just a minute. Captain Varela, Porter said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. This isn't a departmental matter anymore. This is a federal civil rights investigation. The rules just changed. As if summoned by her words, Detective Porter's phone rang. She listened, then looked at Varela. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been notified. Preserve everything. No one leaves. Otis recognized the shift immediately. Federal notification meant his phone call had been taken seriously. Very seriously. This incident had already been classified as something beyond Redmond's lies and bad judgment. It had been classified as a potential federal crime. Captain Varela, Porter continued, will need access to all departmental records related to Officer Redmond. Complaint files, training records, disciplinary actions, body camera policies, everything. I'll need to check with our legal department, Varela began. No, sir, Porter interrupted. You'll need to comply with our federal investigation. Immediately. The word federal seemed to echo in the parking lot like a bell tolling the end of something. Redmond understood that his career was over. Varela understood that his department was about to be dissected by federal investigators. The store manager understood that his assumptions had triggered a chain reaction that would reshape everything. And Otis Hayes understood that Eleanor's dying wish was about to be fulfilled in ways she never could have imagined. The system was finally being held accountable. But accountability, Redmond was learning, was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. Redmond's phone buzzed again with another text from Sarah. Derek, please call me. I'm scared. Redmond looked at the message, then at Detective Porter, then at Otis Hayes. The man whose simple desire to buy groceries had just unraveled 6 years of police work and 36 years of life. Detective Porter looked at Redmond. Last chance, she said quietly. Tell the truth before the footage does. Redmond stared at Sarah's text. And in the distance, sirens grew louder, not coming to help him, but coming because of him. The sirens belonged to Chief Robert Whitlock convoy. 2 patrol cars and his personal vehicle racing toward a situation that had already spiraled beyond departmental control. Whitlock had been in budget meetings when his phone exploded with calls from the mayor, the city attorney, and 3 different news directors. The words federal judge and viral video had cut through every other priority like a knife through paper. Porter pulled up the body camera footage on her tablet as the chief's convoy arrived. The recording caught something that made her blood run cold. Redmond's voice, barely audible, before he approached Otis in the store. Here we go again. Another one thinking he belongs here. The words revealed something devastating. This hadn't been a mistake or a misunderstanding. It had been deliberate profiling, captured in Redmond's own voice. Chief Whitlock emerged from his vehicle like a man stepping into a hurricane. At 58, he'd survived 3 different police scandals and 2 mayoral elections by being politically savvy and legally cautious. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for a federal judge being assaulted by one of his officers in front of rolling cameras. We're going to call this a misunderstanding and handle it internally, Whitlock said as he approached. Then he saw the ID in Otis's hand and stopped talking. Detective Porter, he said instead, his voice tight. Status report. Porter looked up from her tablet, her expression grim. Chief, we have a problem. Officer Redmond's body camera recorded him making racist comments before the confrontation. And the U.S. Attorney's Office has been notified and has requested preservation of everything. The words hit Whitlock like physical blows. A racist comment on camera would end Redmond's career and probably trigger a Department of Justice investigation. And federal notification meant every corner of their department would be exposed to scrutiny. Judge Hayes, Chief Whitlock said, approaching with the deference due to a federal official whose life his department had just turned upside down. I want to personally apologize for Officer Redmond's actions. This is not representative of our department's values. Otis studied Whitlock with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd heard that speech before, from other chiefs in other cities, after other incidents that weren't supposed to represent anyone's values. Chief Whitlock, Otis said quietly, how many complaints has your department received about Officer Redmond? 7, Whitlock replied, his political instincts telling him to be honest. All were investigated and found to be without merit. Who conducted those investigations? Whitlock's pause lasted 3 seconds too long. Various supervisors, depending on the nature of the complaint. Including Captain Varela? Another pause. Yes. Otis nodded slowly, processing the implications. 7 complaints, all dismissed by supervisors who had clear conflicts of interest. It wasn't just Redmond who was corrupt. It was the entire chain of command that had protected him. Porter already had a file on Redmond. She didn't say how. He can turn it on and off, Porter said. That's what makes it worse. Chief Whitlock felt his career crumbling. Federal investigations were one thing. But calculated racism captured on camera was another entirely. We can request his phone through proper process, Porter continued. But if he deletes anything now, it becomes another charge. Meanwhile, Redmond stood frozen beside his patrol car, watching his entire world collapse. His phone buzzed constantly now, Calls from Sarah, from fellow officers, from reporters who'd somehow gotten his number. Each ring represented another relationship that would be destroyed by his choices. The worst call came from his mother, Vivian Redmond, a retired school principal whose voice carried the weight of profound disappointment. "Derek," she said, her words barely audible over the background noise of the parking lot. "I just saw the video. Tell me it's not real." Redmond couldn't speak. "I raised you better than this," Vivian continued, her voice cracking. "Your father died believing that badge meant something." The call ended with the sound of his mother crying. The woman who'd supported him through police academy, who'd been proud when he followed in his father's footsteps, who'd believed he was making the world a better place. Now she knew the truth. Redmond looked across the parking lot at Otis Hayes, who stood with the dignity of someone who'd faced injustice and survived it. Otis wasn't angry or vengeful. He looked tired, sad, disappointed in a way that was somehow worse than rage. "Sir," Redmond said, approaching Otis with steps that felt like walking toward his own execution. "I need to tell you something." Otis turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I knew who you were," Redmond said, his voice barely audible. "Not at first, but I've seen your photo in the newspaper. I've heard other officers complain about your rulings. And when I saw you in that store, I thought—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought what?" Otis asked. "I thought it would be satisfying to take you down a notch. To show you what it felt like to be powerless." The admission hung in the air like a confession that couldn't be taken back. Redmond hadn't just made a mistake. He'd consciously chosen to humiliate a federal judge because of racial prejudice and professional resentment. It was the kind of truth that made forgiveness impossible and redemption seem like a distant dream. Otis stared at Redmond for a long moment, processing the implications of what he'd just heard. This wasn't about assumptions or unconscious bias. This was about conscious hatred, deliberate cruelty, and the abuse of power for personal satisfaction. "Officer Redmond," Otis said quietly, "you've just confessed to intent." Around them, phones continued recording, cameras continued rolling, and federal investigators continued building a case that would reshape everything. Chief Whitlock looked at Porter. "Put him on administrative leave. Now. No more talking." And Redmond realized the department wasn't protecting him anymore. It was protecting itself. The administrative leave was immediate and brutal. Detective Porter escorted Redmond to his patrol car, removed his equipment bag, collected his keys, and handed him a yellow slip of paper that might as well have been a death certificate. No badge, no gun, no radio, no authority. In 30 seconds, Derek Redmond went from police officer to suspended officer with a federal inquiry hanging over his head. "You have 48 hours to retain counsel," Porter said, her voice professionally distant. "Don't leave town. Don't contact witnesses. Don't discuss this case with anyone except your attorney." Redmond stared at the paper in his hands, standard administrative language that felt like reading his own obituary. Around him, the parking lot had filled with news crews and consequences he was only beginning to understand. Chief Whitlock pulled Porter aside, his voice low and urgent. "How bad is this going to get?" "Chief," Redmond just confessed to premeditated civil rights violations on camera, in front of a federal judge, while social media recorded everything. Redmond's phone rang again, Sarah, calling for the 20th time. This time, he answered. "Derek, where are you? The reporters are calling the house. They know about the pregnancy. They know about my dad. They've got your name on every screen." Redmond felt his stomach drop. The media had done their research quickly and thoroughly. His father's heroic death, his pregnant wife, all of it would become part of the narrative. The tragic backstory that was supposed to explain how a good man had gone wrong. "Sarah, I need you to pack a bag and go to your mother's." "What? Why?" "Because this is going to get ugly, and I can't protect you from it." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of Sarah crying. "Derek, what did you do?" The question hung between them like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. How could he explain that he'd destroyed their family's future because he wanted to humiliate an elderly black man? How could he tell his pregnant wife that their daughter would grow up knowing her father as a symbol of police brutality? "I made choices," he said finally. "Bad choices. Don't try to make this about us," Sarah said, her voice turning cold. "This is about who you are when you think nobody's watching." The call ended with Sarah hanging up on him. The woman who'd stood by him through police academy, through his father's death, through 6 years of marriage that had just become a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Meanwhile, Otis stood with Chief Whitlock and Detective Porter, watching Redmond's world collapse in real time. The federal judge who'd come to buy groceries now held the power to destroy a man's entire life with a single decision. "Judge Hayes," Chief Whitlock said carefully, "I know Officer Redmond's actions were inexcusable, but he's got a pregnant wife, and he's clearly struggling with some personal issues. Is there any possibility we could keep this from turning into something bigger than we can control?" It was a plea wrapped in political language, an attempt to save Redmond from the full weight of federal prosecution. But Otis heard what Whitlock wasn't saying. The department was terrified of the federal investigation that would follow. Otis considered the request with the weight of 32 years on the federal bench. He'd seen good people make terrible choices. He'd seen systemic problems disguised as individual failures. "Chief Whitlock," Otis said quietly, "Officer Redmond didn't just assault me. He targeted me because of my race, and because he wanted power." Whitlock's face went pale. "Sir, I understand, but do you?" Otis's voice carried a new edge. "Do you understand that this is exactly what my wife Eleanor spent 20 years trying to prevent?" The questions hit Whitlock like physical blows. This wasn't just about Redmond anymore. It was about every complaint that had been dismissed, every pattern that had been ignored, every time the system had chosen to protect itself instead of the people it served. But Otis wasn't finished. "There's something else, Chief. Something I haven't told you." Porter and Whitlock exchanged glances. Whatever was coming next, Otis's tone suggested it would be devastating. 3 months ago, my office received a letter from a young woman named Lisa Carter. She'd filed a complaint against Officer Redmond for excessive force during a traffic stop. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. Redmond, who'd been standing nearby listening to his career end in real time, felt his blood turn to ice. The complaint was dismissed by Captain Varela due to insufficient evidence, Otis continued. But Ms. Carter's letter included photographs of the bruises on her wrists where Redmond had grabbed her. She was terrified to pursue it further. The revelation struck like lightning. Redmond had a pattern of targeting pregnant women, vulnerable people who couldn't fight back effectively. The 8 months pregnant Sarah at home suddenly took on a different meaning. Redmond was drawn to vulnerability like a predator sensing weakness. Whitlock closed his eyes. A pregnant woman brutalized by Redmond, then dismissed by Varela. Federal judges receiving letters begging for justice that the local system wouldn't provide. The corruption wasn't just covering up mistakes. It was enabling systematic targeting of the most vulnerable people in the community. "Judge Hayes," Whitlock said, his voice barely audible, "why didn't you act on that letter?" "Because one letter with no witnesses and a victim afraid to come forward isn't enough," Otis replied. "But now I have video evidence. Now I have witnesses. Now I have Redmond's own confession." Otis looked across the parking lot at Redmond, who stood alone beside his patrol car like a man waiting for execution. "Sir," Redmond said, his voice breaking, "I know I don't deserve mercy, but my wife is 8 months pregnant, and she doesn't deserve to suffer for what I've done." Otis turned to look at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Officer Redmond," Otis said quietly, "did Lisa Carter deserve to suffer for what you did to her?" The question hung in the air like a judgment that couldn't be appealed. Redmond had no answer because there was no answer. He'd brutalized a pregnant woman and watched the system protect him. Now he was asking for protection from the same system he'd corrupted. In the distance, more news vans were arriving. Federal investigators were requesting files. Social media was spreading the story across the country. The moment for quiet resolution was passing, replaced by public accountability that couldn't be controlled or contained. Otis looked at Whitlock. "You want this quiet? I want it honest." He turned to Porter. "Preserve everything." Then he looked at Redmond. "If you want mercy, you start by telling the truth on record." Redmond swallowed. "What truth?" Otis's voice didn't rise. "All of it. Every stop. Every complaint. Every time you thought you could get away with it." And Redmond realized the next hour wouldn't decide his job. It would decide his freedom. Redmond stared at Otis for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. Around them, the parking lot hummed with activity. News crews setting up, federal investigators coordinating, his entire world restructuring itself around his confession. But all Redmond could hear was the weight of Otis's ultimatum. Tell the truth, or lose any hope of mercy. "On record means what?" Redmond asked, his voice barely audible. Detective Porter stepped forward, producing a digital recorder from her jacket. It means you're choosing to speak voluntarily, on audio. You can stop at any time. And if you lie, the footage will contradict you. Redmond looked at the device like it was a loaded weapon pointed at his heart. Once he started talking, there would be no taking it back. Every word would be preserved, analyzed, used against him in court. But staying silent meant certain destruction. Federal prosecution without any possibility of mitigation. Derek. The voice belonged to Captain Varela, who'd been conspicuously quiet during the federal notifications and media attention. Redmond turned to see his supervisor approaching with an expression that looked almost sympathetic. Derek, don't say anything, Varela said quietly. Keep quiet, and I'll make sure this stays administrative. Talk, and you'll be indicted. It was exactly what Redmond wanted to hear. Someone offering him an escape from Otis's impossible choice. Varela had been covering for him for years, dismissing complaints and protecting him from consequences. Maybe he could do it one more time. But Otis's voice cut through the false hope like a blade. Captain Varela, Otis said, are you advising Officer Redmond to remain silent about his pattern of civil rights violations? The question was a trap, and Varela walked straight into it. I'm advising him to protect himself. The same way you protected Lisa Carter? Or the other 6 people who filed complaints against him? Varela's face went pale as he realized Otis knew about the dismissed complaints. Every case Varela had buried was about to be exhumed and examined under federal scrutiny. Redmond watched the exchange with growing horror. Varela wasn't trying to help him. He was trying to protect himself. Every piece of advice, every dismissed complaint, every cover-up had been about insulating Varela from accountability. Redmond had been a useful tool, and now that he'd become a liability, Varela was cutting him loose. How many others? Redmond asked suddenly. Varela frowned. What? How many other officers are like me? How many complaints have you buried? How many people have you told to keep quiet? The questions hung in the air like accusations that couldn't be denied. Varela's expression shifted from sympathetic to calculating as he realized Redmond was considering talking. Redmond, you need to be very careful. They're not accusations, Redmond said, his voice growing stronger. They're questions. And if I'm going down, I want to know how deep this goes. Otis watched Redmond's transformation with something that might have been hope. For the first time since this began, Redmond was asking the right questions, not about how to escape consequences, but about how many other people had been hurt by the system that protected him. Detective Porter activated her recorder. Officer Redmond, do you wish to make a statement regarding your conduct? Redmond looked at Varela, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. He looked at Chief Whitlock, who was frantically texting someone, probably the mayor or city attorney. He looked at Otis Hayes, who stood with the patience of someone who'd waited 32 years for this moment. Then he looked at his phone, where Sarah's last text message still glowed. Who are you when you think nobody's watching? Yes, Redmond said. I want to make a statement. Varela stepped forward. Redmond, as your supervisor, I'm ordering you to. You're not my supervisor anymore, Redmond interrupted. I'm on administrative leave, remember? You made sure of that. Redmond turned to Porter and nodded at the recorder. Where do you want me to start? Start with Lisa Carter, Otis said quietly. Redmond closed his eyes, remembering the traffic stop 3 months earlier. Lisa Carter, 8 months pregnant, driving home from a doctor's appointment in her husband's car. Redmond had pulled her over for a broken taillight, then escalated when she'd asked why she couldn't just get a warning. I grabbed her wrists when she tried to get out of the car, Redmond said, his voice mechanical. She was pregnant, scared, and I wanted control. I wanted her to stop talking back. The confession hit like a bomb in the parking lot. News crews stepped closer, phones recorded everything, and Varela realized his own career was being destroyed by Redmond's honesty. She filed a complaint, Redmond continued, with photos of the bruises. Varela called it insufficient evidence and buried it. On whose orders? Porter asked. Redmond looked at Varela, who was shaking his head frantically. But Redmond had crossed the line. There was no going back now. His own. Varela has been covering for officers like me for years. We call it blue protection. As long as you're loyal to the department protects you from consequences. Varela stepped backward, his face a mask of betrayal and panic. Redmond, you don't know what you're doing. I'm telling the truth, Redmond said. Something I should have done years ago. The admission was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Other officers who'd arrived for crowd control exchanged nervous glances. News reporters scribbled notes furiously. Chief Whitlock looked like a man watching his department implode in real time. But Redmond wasn't finished. "Judge Hayes," he said, turning to Otis. "After you gave me your ID, I recognized the name. I've heard officers complain about you. About judges who don't back the badge. And instead of stopping, I doubled down, because I didn't want to be wrong." Otis's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. The revelation was devastating enough. Redmond hadn't just made a mistake. He'd recognized a federal judge and chosen to escalate anyway, driven by professional resentment and racial prejudice. Chief Whitlock stepped forward. "Detective Porter," he said tightly, "get him away from the cameras. Now." Porter didn't move. "Not until we preserve the statement." Redmond kept talking. "Names. Dates. Case numbers." Varela backed away like the ground was cracking. And Porter didn't blink, because now it was all on record. "Officer Redmond," Otis said quietly, "what you're doing takes courage. But courage doesn't erase the damage you've caused." Redmond nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, sir. I can't fix what I've done. But maybe I can prevent it from happening to someone else." The confession had destroyed careers and exposed corruption, but it had also revealed the human cost of a system that had lost its way. Every name Redmond mentioned represented another family affected, another community betrayed, another victim who'd been told their pain didn't matter. Porter's phone buzzed. She listened, then looked up. "Captain Varela," she said. "Internal Affairs wants you in an interview room. Now." And for the first time, Varela looked afraid. Varela walked toward Detective Porter's unmarked car like a man walking to his own execution. The swagger, the authority, the confidence that had protected him for 20 years. All of it had evaporated in the span of Redmond's 15-minute confession. Other officers watched him go, their expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation as they wondered who would be next. "Captain," one of the younger officers called out. "What should we tell the press?" Varela stopped, turned back, and for a moment looked like he might try to salvage something from the wreckage. Then he saw the cameras, the phones, the investigators taking notes, and realized there was nothing left to salvage. "Tell them the truth," he said quietly. "For once in our careers, let's just tell them the truth." It was the first honest thing Varela had said in years, and everyone knew it. As Varela's car pulled away, Chief Whitlock faced the inevitable. His phone was buzzing constantly. The mayor, the city attorney, the police union, reporters, and investigators all demanding answers he didn't have. In 35 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen a situation spiral this completely beyond control. "Judge Hayes," Whitlock said, approaching Otis with the defeated expression of someone who knew the conversation was already over. "What happens now?" Otis considered the question with the weight of 3 decades on the federal bench. Around him, Redmond's confession was spreading through social media. News crews were broadcasting live, and investigators were already requesting files that would reshape the entire department. Now, Chief Whitlock, you have a choice. Preserve the evidence. Suspend everyone involved. And stop the cover-ups. Whitlock looked across the parking lot at Redmond, who stood beside Detective Porter answering follow-up questions with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. "And the officers involved?" "Officer Redmond will be investigated and charged if the evidence supports it," Otis said. "He'll never work in law enforcement again, but he'll have the opportunity to rebuild his life based on truth instead of lies." "And the others?" "The officers who took Varela's advice and stayed quiet. They'll have the same opportunity Redmond just had, to tell the truth and accept accountability. Those who choose to keep lying will face the consequences of that choice." Whitlock nodded slowly, understanding that Otis wasn't just offering justice. He was offering a path toward redemption for everyone willing to walk it. Meanwhile, Redmond finished his statement and approached Otis with the careful movements of someone who no longer took anything for granted. "Sir," Redmond said, "I know this doesn't change anything. But I want you to know, this is the first time in 6 years I've felt like a human being instead of just a badge." Otis studied Redmond's face, seeing something he'd rarely encountered. Genuine transformation born from confronting the worst parts of oneself. "Officer Redmond," Otis said, "you asked me earlier what your daughter would think of you. The answer is, that depends on what you do with the rest of your life." Redmond nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I want to spend it trying to repair the damage I've caused. Then you'll have that opportunity. The question is whether you'll take it." Detective Porter guided Redmond toward her car, away from the cameras. Standard procedure once the statement was secured. Detective Porter approached Otis, her expression thoughtful. Judge Hayes, I have to ask, why didn't you press for maximum prosecution from the beginning? Otis considered the question, thinking about Eleanor's last words to him in the hospital. Don't let anger make you forget who you're supposed to be. My wife used to say the goal is accountability and change, not excuses. Porter nodded slowly. And you think Redmond can change? I think Redmond discovered something he'd lost a long time ago. Porter lifted her radio. Internal Affairs. Open a case on Captain Varela. Effective now. Whitlock flinched. Because this time, it wasn't a rumor. It was a record. Around them, the machinery of justice was beginning to turn in ways that would reshape everything. Internal Affairs was requesting files. Community leaders were demanding accountability. Officers throughout the department were making choices about whether to follow Varela's path of denial or Redmond's path of truth. Otis's phone buzzed with a message from his clerk. Chief wants you downtown. Now. Otis looked at the message, then at Redmond disappearing into the back of the car, cuffs catching the light. Around him, the parking lot was emptying as news crews rushed to file stories. Investigators headed back to offices to begin processing evidence, and officers returned to patrol duties that would never quite be the same. Otis picked up the medicine from the ground, carefully, and held it like proof. This had started with groceries, and it was going to end with accountability. 6 months later, Otis Hayes stood in the produce section of the same grocery store, holding a basket instead of a cart this time. The fluorescent lights hummed the same tune. The automatic sprinklers still misted the vegetables every 15 minutes, and the checkout lines moved with the same unhurried efficiency they always had. But everything else had changed. The store manager, a new one, nodded respectfully as Otis passed. The security guard, an elderly black woman named Grace, smiled and asked about his knee. 3 customers recognized him and offered quiet words of support. The teenage cashier who'd filmed the original incident now worked at the customer service counter, her name tag reading, Destiny, Assistant Manager. The viral video had done more than destroy careers. It had transformed a community's relationship with accountability. Detective Porter found him near the canned goods, holding a 1-page letter on department letterhead. Judge Hayes, she said, approaching with the professional respect that had replaced their crisis-born familiarity. I wanted to give you an update before the hearing tomorrow. Otis set down a can of soup, the same brand that had scattered across the parking lot 6 months ago. How many accepted the plea agreements? 14 officers, including Redmond. Varela is going to trial. Porter paused. Redmond's sentencing is next week. Otis nodded. 14 officers had chosen Redmond's path of accountability over Varela's path of denial. The federal investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct that stretched back 8 years, involving over 40 victims whose complaints had been systematically buried. But it had also revealed something else. Officers like Sergeant Coleman, who'd known about the problems but didn't know how to report them safely. Young officers who'd been taught that loyalty meant silence. A community that wanted to trust police but had learned not to. What about Redmond's family? Otis asked. Porter's expression softened. His wife filed for divorce. She's moving back to her mother's house in Oregon with the baby. Emma was born 3 weeks ago. The news hit Otis like a physical weight. Redmond's choices had cost him everything, his career, his freedom, his family. But they'd also given him something he'd never had. The possibility of rebuilding his life on truth instead of lies. He asked me to pass along a message, Porter continued, pulling out a small envelope. Otis opened it to find a brief handwritten note. Judge Hayes, my daughter will grow up knowing her father told the truth when it mattered. Thank you for showing me that was possible. Derek Redmond. Below the signature was a small photo. Redmond in an orange jumpsuit, holding his newborn daughter through the glass at the county jail. His expression was exhausted, heartbroken, but somehow peaceful. For the first time in years, Derek Redmond looked like a man who could sleep at night. Otis studied the photo, remembering his conversation with Eleanor about the difference between punishment and justice. Redmond was facing a short federal sentence under the plea agreement, would lose his pension, and never work in law enforcement again. But his daughter would know that her father had chosen honesty over self-protection when the choice mattered most. That was a legacy worth building a life on. Judge Hayes, Porter said, there's something else. The city created an oversight board after the settlement. Real civilian review with access to records. They want to offer you the chair position. Otis looked up from the photo. The Community Oversight Board was exactly the kind of systemic change Eleanor had dreamed about. I'm 73 years old, detective. I'm supposed to be shopping for groceries and reading mystery novels. Porter smiled. My grandmother is 87. She runs 3 neighborhood watch programs and a community garden. Age doesn't disqualify you from making a difference. Otis considered the offer, thinking about Eleanor's final words. Don't let anger make you forget who you're supposed to be. The oversight board would be difficult, contentious work. Mediating between police and community, investigating complaints, implementing reforms that neither side would fully appreciate. It would also be exactly what Eleanor would want him to do with the rest of his life. I'll consider it, Otis said, which they both knew meant yes. As Porter walked away, Otis finished his shopping in peace. No one followed him. No one questioned his right to be there. No one saw his presence as a threat or an opportunity for harassment. He paid for his groceries, the same items he'd tried to buy 6 months earlier, and walked toward the exit. Near the door sat a simple bench, Eleanor Hayes' bench, donated by the community center. Otis stopped, touched by a gesture he hadn't expected. Otis loaded the groceries into his trunk and paused. For a moment, he saw it again, cans rolling, strangers yelling, an officer's grip tightening. Then he saw what was real now, people looking him in the eye. A guard who asked about his knee. A cashier who didn't flinch. He drove home with the groceries intact. And when he carried them into his kitchen, past Eleanor's photo, he realized something simple and holy. The groceries had finally made it home. And so had he. What did this story teach you about the courage it takes to choose truth over comfort? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.